Okay, so picture this. You're sound asleep in your bed, middle of the night, and suddenly, bam, frantic pounding on your front door.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, right. And through the window, you see a man clearly injured, blood everywhere, begging for help.
Oh, no.
But before you can even react, he's gone, vanished just like that.
Spooky.
Totally. But the really chilling part is he leaves behind this bloody handprint on the door.
Ah, that's creepy.
Right. So that's how the story of the Boise murder mansion begins. And you guys asked us to deep dive into it, specifically the Morbid podcast episode, and unpack all the twists and turns.
Well, what always gets me is how a seemingly ordinary home in Boise became the scene of this horrific crime, and then all the rumors of hauntings swirling around it.
It's wild how places can take on these stories almost like they become characters themselves.
Totally.
So let's rewind back to 1987, 805 West Linden Street, the house where everything went down. The Morbid episode does a great job setting the scene, starting with Clinton Sparks, the neighbor, who stumbled into this whole nightmare.
It's important to remember this was before everyone had cell phones.
Yeah, good point.
So when Clinton was woken up by someone running and yelling, his only option was to use his landline. Imagine that feeling, hearing those desperate cries, seeing that bloody handprint, but not knowing how to get help quickly.
It's terrifying, for sure. He calls 911, reports the disturbance, asks for someone to check it out. But here's where things get really frustrating. The dispatcher, totally focused on a fire across town, doesn't even flag Clinton's call as an emergency.
That's a huge issue. It really raises questions about how 911 calls are prioritized and how those decisions can have devastating consequences. What seems minor to one person could be life or death for another.
Absolutely. And sadly, in this case, it took almost an hour for an officer to be dispatched, and even then the call was reassigned and never followed up on.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't until the next day when another neighbor found a massive amount of blood in the street that the police finally started investigating.
So that blood trail basically becomes the key piece of the puzzle.
For sure.
It physically connects the violence to the front door of 805 West Linden, the home of Daniel and Catherine Rogers.
The Rogers, though, they claim they weren't even home that night and have no clue about the blood. But of course, the story doesn't end there. When officers return with a warrant, they find the blood trail continues inside the house.
No way.
Yeah, leading them straight to the basement where they find a huge stash of marijuana.
Okay, so now we're talking about drugs, a potential crime scene, and a couple who seem pretty shady.
Right. It's not just a simple whodunit anymore. The Rogers are arrested for drug possession, but with no victim, the police can't press more serious charges. However, the judge, sensing something's off, sets their bond at a whopping $200,000 to $50,000 each.
Whoa, that's a huge red flag. It shows how serious the situation is, even without a confirmed victim.
Definitely. And just when you think things can't get any weirder, two 13-year-old boys are fishing in the Snake River and snag something horrifying, plastic bags filled with human remains.
Oh my gosh, it's awful.
It's a truly gruesome discovery. And tragically, this was just the beginning. More bags surfaced in the Brownlee Reservoir, totaling 13 in all, containing the dismembered remains of 21-year-old Preston Murr.
The brutality is just chilling, and the way they tried to hide the body, it's really disturbing.
The Morbid episode then delves into Preston Murr's background, describing him as a petty criminal with minor offenses, not someone known for violence. Just days before his disappearance, he attended a funeral where a fight broke out involving Daniel Rogers. Could this be a possible connection?
It's definitely something to consider. Could that altercation have escalated? Was there bad blood between Preston and Daniel?
And here's where things get even more unsettling. Preston actually called the police after the funeral, reporting threats against him.
Oh, wow.
And get this, he reached out to Daniel Rogers and another man, Darren Cox, thinking they might know who was behind the threats.
So the victim knew the suspects.
Exactly. And a cashier at a local convenience store remembers seeing Preston using the payphone with a baseball bat, joined by Daniel and Darren. They then spent hours driving around seemingly looking for something. Later that night, Preston called his girlfriend, mentioning they were headed back to Daniel Rogers' house on Linden Street.
So they were all together right before Preston disappeared.
It all starts to line up. Investigators believe that sometime after midnight, an argument broke out at the house, leading to Preston being shot in the shoulder. Remember Clinton Sparks and the bloody handprint?
Right.
They believe that was Preston desperately seeking help before being dragged back inside.
Oh my gosh.
Now the episode takes us deeper into Daniel Rogers' past, revealing a history of violence, including a conviction for killing his friend, a gunshot to the head. He served only 5 years for that crime.
Okay, so this guy has a history of violence.
And to add another layer of complexity, the episode reveals Daniel and Catherine were making a living, selling drugs, and even receiving foster care payments, which is a whole other issue.
Wow, that's messed up.
With Preston's remains recovered, the autopsy reveals he was killed by a single gunshot to the head, likely from a .357 caliber handgun.
Yeah.
However, the condition of his body made it difficult to assess for other injuries.
It makes you wonder what else happened in that house.
While investigators strongly suspected Daniel Rogers, they needed more evidence to build a solid case. That's when they interview Preston's girlfriend. She provides crucial details about the threatening phone calls, Preston's belief that Daniel and Darren might have answers, and that last phone call where Preston mentions going back to Daniel's house on Linden Street.
So her testimony puts Preston at the scene with the suspects.
And with that new information, the net starts to close in on Daniel Rogers. But the story takes another unexpected turn, and we'll dive into all of that in the next part of our deep dive.
Things really start to heat up when detectives identify Daniel's accomplice, 31-year-old Darren Cox.
Oh, so they figure out he wasn't alone in all this.
Right, and Cox, maybe realizing how bad things look, decides to cooperate with the police.
Always interesting when one of the perpetrators flips. What did Darren reveal?
He basically tells all to him. Detective Dave Smith admits that after Daniel shot Preston, he was ordered to get rid of the body. Remember those 13 trash bags in the river?
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine.
And it gets worse. Cox leads investigators to a dumpster where they find even more of Preston's remains. His torso, blood-soaked clothing, the whole thing.
Oh, God, that's awful. This must have been a huge break for the prosecution.
Absolutely. Cox's confession directly implicates both men in the murder and the cover-up. So the defense tries to get his statements thrown out, arguing they were coerced or unreliable.
Trying to discredit the witness, pretty standard tactic.
But the judge, recognizing how important this testimony is, allows it to be presented at trial.
So it goes to court.
Yeah, and the defense also tries to get the trial closed to the public, claiming the graphic details could prejudice the jury.
Wow, trying to keep the public out of the courtroom. That's bold.
It is, but the judge thankfully denies their request, opting for transparency.
Good. So the trial begins in March 1988. What was the prosecution strategy?
Prosecutor Greg Bauer lays out the state's case, emphasizing the brutality of the crime and suggesting a motive, a possible argument over drugs.
Sounds pretty straightforward, focusing on the facts.
But here's the thing. Remember those prior charges against Rogers for assault and drugs?
Yeah.
Well, Bauer mentions them in his opening statement, even though the judge had ruled against it.
Well, that's a big mistake. Could have thrown the whole case.
The defense obviously jumps on it, demands a mistrial, but the judge surprisingly refuses, and the trial continues.
Wow, that was close. So what happens next?
Witness after witness takes the stand, crime scene technicians detailing the blood trail, the bullet fragments, even an axe buried in the garden.
It's crazy how all those little details build the case. Did they have any forensic evidence directly linking Rogers to the murder weapon?
They do. They present fingerprint evidence tying Rogers to the gun, and the bullets that killed Preston, DNA testing wasn't around back then, but they were able to match the blood found at the scene to Preston's blood type.
Pretty impressive work, considering the limitations back then.
Yeah.
What about Darren Cox? Did he end up testifying?
He did, and becomes a key witness for the prosecution. He describes the lead up to the murder, the argument in the basement, even helping to dismember and dispose of the body. It's a chilling first-hand account.
But I'm guessing his credibility was questioned by the defense.
Of course, if you're the defense, you're going to try to discredit someone who was involved in the crime.
Right. So what happens when it's the defense's turn?
They come up with this shocking and frankly unbelievable explanation for Daniel Rogers' involvement or lack thereof. Their whole argument hinges on one claim. Daniel Rogers has an extreme phobia of blood.
Wait, a phobia of blood? Seriously? That seems pretty far-fetched considering what happened.
It's a risky strategy for sure. They're trying to create reasonable doubt, suggesting someone terrified of blood couldn't have committed such a gruesome crime.
So what did Rogers have to say for himself?
He takes the stand, tells the jury he couldn't have been involved because the sight of blood makes him sick. Claims Darren Cox was the one who went crazy and that he only fired a warning shot to break up the fight.
But didn't he kill his friend a few years earlier? How does he explain that?
Right. That past violence definitely contradicts his claims of innocence and his supposed phobia of blood. It's classic trying to shift the blame onto someone else. The jury now has to decide what to believe his word against the mountain of evidence from the prosecution.
It's like a real-life courtroom drama, two completely different stories.
Yeah.
So what did the jury decide? It sounds like a tough decision for the jury. What happened?
Well, after weeks of testimony and all that evidence, they only deliberated for a little over 6 hours.
Really? That's pretty quick.
It is, which suggests they were pretty much all on the same page, and they found Daniel Rogers guilty of first-degree murder.
Wow, I bet that was a huge relief for Preston Murr's family.
Absolutely. His mother was so relieved and happy with the verdict. She finally got some justice for her son's murder.
So Rogers is sentenced to life in prison. Case closed, right?
Not so fast. Darren Cox, seeing that Rogers was convicted, decides to change his plea.
Oh, interesting. What did he end up pleading?
He admits to being an accessory to a felony and aggravated assault.
So he admits he was involved, but avoids a harsher sentence.
Exactly. He gets a plea deal in exchange for his testimony.
What do you think about that? Seems kind of light considering what happened.
It's a tough one. His cooperation was definitely key in getting Rogers convicted. But yeah, his sentence 5 years and a $10,000 fine does feel pretty lenient, considering he helped dismember and dispose of the body.
Did he give any explanation for his actions?
He claimed he only helped Rogers because he was being threatened, but that's hard to believe given the brutality of the crime.
Right, it's just a horrific situation all around. So the morbid episode then shifts gears from the trial to the house itself and how it became this local legend.
And that's where things get really interesting. The house becomes the symbol of everything creepy and morbid about the case.
Like the house itself absorbed all the darkness.
Totally. The episode mentions that other people had died in the house before, but those were natural deaths years earlier.
Do you think that adds to the whole haunted house vibe?
Oh, for sure. It all gets mixed up in the story, blurring the lines between what's real and what's imagined.
And then you have all the rumors, the blood running down the walls, the woman in the window, even that made-up story about it being a frat house with paranormal activity.
It's like people need an explanation for something so awful, so they create these stories to try and make sense of it.
The episode also has some eyewitness accounts, people who visited or stayed in the house and felt this creepy presence, especially in the basement where the murder took place. Some even claim to have seen ghosts in the windows.
It's hard to know what to believe with those kinds of stories.
Yeah.
Some people might genuinely feel like they experienced something paranormal, but it could also be their imagination running wild.
Yeah, it's like we see what we want to see. So the episode ends with a pretty interesting update. The current owner is planning to offer tours of the Boise murder mansion.
Wow, that's wild.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And some of the money will go towards preserving the property.
It really speaks to our fascination with true crime, even turning it into entertainment.
Definitely. It makes you wonder what draws people to these dark stories and places.
I think it's a mix of things. Curiosity, a need to understand the worst parts of human nature, maybe even a way to face our own fears.
That's a great point. Well, this has been a fascinating look into the Boise murder mansion. It really shows how truth can be stranger than fiction, and how even the most ordinary places can hold such darkness. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, listeners.
Absolutely.
We always love hearing your thoughts, so let us know in the comments what you think about this case. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into captivating stories and mysteries. We'll see you next time.